As mentioned in the previous lesson, the agricultural revolution, or the invention of farming, happened in several areas of the world independently of each other around 12,000 years ago. This means that people in different regions invented farming by themselves because, as far as we can tell, there is no evidence that these groups of people had any contact with each other until long after there was evidence of farming in both places. You might be asking yourself, that seems weird. How could this happen so quickly, all at once, in so many places separated by such great distances? Some people have made a lot of money suggesting it must have been aliens. In reality, when we say around the same time, that's in the grand scale of time. Remember, our species Homo sapiens have been around for at least 300,000 years. So in the context, within a few thousand years of each other, is pretty much around the same time. Hunter-gatherers in Mesopotamia and Egypt, an area that we now call the Fertile Crescent, developed farming around 12,000 years ago. This was followed by hunter-gatherers in China between the Yangtze and Yellow River basins between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. On the other side of the world, people in central Mexico figured it out between 8 and 9,000 years ago. It also developed in other places independently, such as Papua New Guinea highlands between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago. Northern South America developed it around 5 to 4,000 years ago. People in sub-Saharan Africa figured it out about 5 to 4,000 years ago. And in Eastern North America, it was figured out between 4 and 3,000 years ago. Now you have to remember that it's hard to get exact dates from things that happened this long ago, but we can usually figure it out in time ranges through radiocarbon dating and other techniques we mentioned in earlier lessons. So when we say that farming developed around the world in different places around the same time, we really mean within about 9,000 years of each other. But why is farming such a big deal? Well, think about it. Without farming, each of us would be responsible for finding food sources, killing or gathering it, and then preparing it for ourselves. This is how humans existed for at least 200 to 300,000 years before we figured out agriculture. But over time, eventually people noticed that seeds that were thrown away grew out of trash piles into plants that grew more of that same food. And if they only planted the seeds from plants that produced the biggest apples, dates, wheat, corn, or whatever it is you're growing, then you'd be able to produce larger and larger varieties of that food over time. On the left, you can see how corn started out in its wild version, but over time, by planting only the seeds of larger and larger stalks, then eventually you get the modern corn ear stalk, which looks like the one on the right. Eventually, we figured this out with animals as well, which led to animals that were once wild, eventually turning into the animals that you're familiar with today that rely on us to survive, such as the modern cow. Here you can see what the wild ancestor of the modern cow once looked like. Once it was domesticated in the Neolithic period, it began to look more like this as we selectively bred it to have smaller horns, so it was less of a threat to us. Throughout the Iron Age, we continued to selectively breed it to have more meat and produce more milk that we used for our own food, until eventually, today, it looks like the modern cow. Some of these animals we used to do hard work for us, like oxen and horses. Others, like cows and chickens, were used as food sources. This explosion of access to food meant that more people lived long enough to have children, leading to a population explosion of the human species. Before the agricultural revolution, the human population on the entire planet was probably less than 1 million. In contrast, New York City today alone has over 8 million people living there. Within 10,000 years of the agricultural revolution, the worldwide human population went from less than a million to 170 million and has continued to grow ever since. Today, there are just under 8 billion of us on Earth, all possible because of the massive increase to our food supply created by the switch from hunting and gathering to agriculture. A population explosion of that magnitude wasn't seen again until the Industrial Revolution. There are some who now question whether or not the switch to agriculture was the best deal for humans, as hunters and gatherers tended to have a more varied diet, had more free time, never had slavery, and were seemingly more egalitarian, or equal societies than agricultural societies. Yuval Harari does a great job of looking at this in his book Sapiens, which I highly recommend. In addition to the massive population increase, it also meant that one person could now produce more food than they needed for themselves and their family. This surplus food freed up people to do jobs other than finding food. This led to the development of specialized workers, people who do jobs other than getting food to feed themselves. Now that some people didn't have to focus on their own food production, they could focus on metalwork to make tools and weapons, work as scribes to record information, soldiers to protect cities, and on it goes. But also with larger populations came the problem of how to keep people from falling into chaos. Studies show that people can really only effectively manage knowledge of about 150 friends and or acquaintances. These early cities had populations of tens of thousands. This is where the cognitive revolution of 70,000 years ago came in handy, allowing us to create works of fiction. We used this new skill to create religions and governments to help organize people and enforce order. Religion carried with it the threat of punishment from the gods if you lied, cheated, or did not behave in a trustworthy way. Government served the same role with threats of prison, exile, and or death. We call these systems that help organize large groups of people so that they can work with each other complex institutions. Government, also known as the state, and religion both make it so that thousands of people could live side by side with at least some certainty that they could work, trade, and live with other people, even if they weren't in a close group of 150 friends and acquaintances. And the increased food supply that made the larger populations possible also meant that some people could specialize in the jobs of priests to communicate with the gods, and kings to enforce the laws, and soldiers to defend the cities. They could focus on these jobs because farmers produced enough to support all of them. These complex institutions also made it possible for these large groups to work together to build complex irrigation systems to water crops the farmers grew, build walls to protect cities from invading armies, and massive temples to house and honor their gods. The agricultural revolution's invention of farming is the foundation of all civilization. Even today, our world is built on the backs of farmers. Farming led to larger populations, the ability to support workers specializing in new skills and developing new technology, and the need to create complex institutions like governments and religions to ensure these larger groups of people were able to work together to accomplish incredibly impressive feats. Our next lesson will be looking at the early villages that farming led to, and the trade networks that connected them, eventually leading to some of them turning into some of the world's first cities.